This morning, we have a particular topic that we're going to be looking at, and the topic is that of tithing. And we're going to be trying to answer several different questions about it. Primarily, we're going to be asking, is it applicable today? And also asking, how much was tithing? How much of a percentage was it of the total income of those that it was bound on? So, traditionally, of course, tithing is understood as a tenth. And if you go back to the word itself, tithe, it means a tenth. If you go back to the Hebrew word from which it comes, it means a tenth. And so it does mean a tenth. And yet, a tenth can add up, which sounds kind of strange, but we're going to look at exactly how all this worked in the Old Testament. But as we get started, we'll look at a little bit of background on the subject. So, as far as tithing goes in general, is tithing bound in the New Testament? Well, the answer has to be no, because of a twofold reason. One, we don't have evidence for it, and two, we have evidence for something different. So we don't have any evidence for tithing being bound in the New Testament. The only place that some people go is to Matthew chapter 23, verses 22 and 23, where Jesus says that the Pharisees tithe certain spices that they have, and yet they neglect the weightier matters of the law, like faith and justice and mercy. So is Jesus binding tithing there? Well, not really. He's just saying that the Pharisees, in fact, tithe. Well, why do they tithe? Because they're Jews, and the Jews tithed under the Jewish system. So we don't find evidence for it. And then on the other hand, we do see evidence. We see command and example of giving by choice, or we call it free will giving. And so we practice that today because the New Testament church, throughout the New Testament, they are recorded as giving according to what they were able to do, giving as they felt like they should, and so that's what we do today. We'll talk more about that toward the end of the lesson. Now, tithing itself, though, under the old law, it had two different functions. So on the one hand, tithing is kind of the same as giving today, in that there was a portion of that money that would go toward the work of the Lord. And today when we give, we understand that that's what our money is going toward as well. But on the other hand, tithing had a secondary function that our giving does not today. In that the Jews were a nation of themselves, and they were a religious nation, but that meant that if they were going to provide for themselves as a nation, they had to do so by this form of tithing. So what I'm saying is that tithing, in addition to being the giving that would happen like we do on each Sunday, tithing was also the tax that was required as just being a member of the Jewish nation. So we don't get taxed today under the New Testament system, but that's part of what this money was. Now, it didn't go to roads because they didn't really keep up the roads the way that we do today. It didn't go to libraries, didn't go to military service even. That was expected to be done just as part of being a Jew. But it did go towards some public things, and we'll talk about that as well. But the tax side of this is limited to certain public duties. So the primary place that the tithing money went was to the Levitical tribe. So if I say that, and I mention the Levites, then you probably have a vague idea of who that is. But let's form a baseline here and then build on the knowledge that we have already. So hopefully we know that the Levites are one of the tribes of Israel, and they correspond to one of these sons of Jacob, and so there is this one tribe in Israel that is singled out as being dedicated to God. Now, actually, whenever the Jews came out of Egypt, it was that the firstborn child of every household was going to serve God in this manner, but it switched to the Levites later on. So the Levites now are this one tribe dedicated to serving the Lord. And so what do the Levites do? If I ask you what was the job of the Levites in the Old Testament, then I bet the answer I'm going to get is that they served in the temple. And while that is sort of true, it's mostly false. Because the Levites, by and large, did not serve in the temple. Rather, the Aaronic priest served in the temple, as in those who descended specifically from Aaron. So there was a group within a group then, because Aaron himself was a Levite. Actually, he was the grandson or great-grandson of Levi. So he was a Levite, but only his children were able to serve in the tabernacle and then later the temple. Now, the other Levites could assist in that somewhat. They could bring wood for the offerings made on the altar and that kind of thing. But that was not their primary job. So the majority of the Levites were not temple workers, even though that's kind of traditionally what we associate them with. But instead, the Levites had other roles. So the roles that we don't think about as often, the Levites would serve as guards. And this was true whenever Israel was still wandering around, but it was also true whenever everything was settled. They would be guards of the temple as well as any other religious places or other places that needed guarding. In addition to being or serving as guards, they were also teachers of the law. And whenever the synagogues came into use, they would have been a lot of the people that were teaching in the synagogues, and people that ended up being rabbis would have been of this Levitical tribe. They also were to maintain the 6 cities of refuge. So if you accidentally killed someone, you could flee to a certain city. There were 6 of them scattered throughout Israel, and it was the job of the Levites to maintain these cities and also to guard these cities from someone that might come trying to kill you because you'd killed one of their relatives. So they had that job as well. They also had 2 other functions. One was kind of like a notary. They would serve as witnesses of public agreements. So if you and I agreed to sell a certain piece of land, we would have to do that in front of a Levite because they're supposed to be trustworthy and they'll serve as a witness for that agreement. The other thing that they did was that they would check the scales of business people and in marketplaces in general. So they would, the closest thing I can think of today is it's kind of like how the Department of Agriculture checks the gas pumps to make sure there's been no tampering with it. It's kind of a weird idea, but that's what they did. They made sure that the scales were fair and honest, and you weren't cheating somebody out of whatever it was, the grain that you were weighing out to them. So those are a lot of the jobs that Levites had. And those aren't all directly related to the temple, but the whole point is that the Levites did not have a portion with Israel, as the verses that were read for us from Deuteronomy chapter 14, the very last verses there, as they point out. They don't have a section of land that's dedicated to them, except for the cities of refuge and the land immediately around those. But they couldn't really provide for themselves. And so the whole nation of Israel took the responsibility of providing for this one tribe that provided civil and religious services to them. And that's why the tithe was in place, mostly. And there's some other uses of the tithe, but that's mostly what we're talking about. So what exactly was tithed, though? Today, when people talk about tithing, they almost exclusively mean in terms of money given to a church. Well, twofold. One, we already said tithing's not bound on the New Testament church, so unless you're Jewish, you don't really have a reason to be tithing. But 2, it was usually, and especially early on, never in terms of money. So if we look in the same chapter that it was read for us in chapter 14 of Deuteronomy, if you look in verse 22, Deuteronomy 14:22, it says, "You shall truly tithe all of the increase of your grain in the field that the field produces year by year." Verse 23, "And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide. The tithe of your grain, as we already said, of your new wine, of your oil, of the firstborn of your herds and of your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." So there are 5 different things, but as you'll notice, they all happen to be food, or something that makes food eventually. So it was not the money that the Jews had, rather it was the livelihood that they had in a more literal sense, what they lived off of. Now, all of that, of course, is in the context of an agrarian society and a non-monetary society like we are today. And there was even a provision under the old law that if you had a long distance to travel, it was too difficult to take these physical items up to the temple, that instead you could sell them where you lived, and then you could bring the money to the temple and you could buy the same things at the temple that you would have brought in the first place. That's actually why we see Jesus later on having to cleanse the temple from all these buyers and sellers, because it had become a real business, and they would mark up these things instead of selling them fairly. But the whole point is, it wasn't money almost ever, and on top of that, it was for the Levites. But if we look at that and we say, okay, now we understand what the tithe is, well, only partially, and maybe this gets a little too technical, but there is not just one tithe and not just one offering. We're going to talk about all of those. We're going to try to explain what the difference is and how much that really adds up to. But a few things before we discuss those required tithes. One note before that is that there is some disagreement when it comes to these tithes. The disagreement is mostly in how much the tithes were and in how many there are and whether they overlap. But what we're going to do is go according to Jewish tradition. So it's possible that this isn't how it was from the beginning, but for the several hundred years before Christ, this is what Jews understood. That's how we're going to look at this. So that's the first note. The second note, and this will become important as we look through here, the Jews were on a cycle that repeated itself every 50 years, but it also repeated itself every 7 years. So it's called the sabbatical, and sabbatical, of course, coming from the word Sabbath. So we know that the Jews worked 6 days, and on the seventh day, they rested on the Sabbath day. Well, the same thing was true for years, except in this case, it's not the people, but instead it's the land. And so God said in his commands that the Jews would work their fields for 6 years, and on the seventh year, they would not plant anything. So, and they wouldn't take in the produce of whatever it was, even if it was olives or figs or anything else, they wouldn't gather that. So you actually have a 6-year period in which you are tithing, and on that seventh year, you don't have anything to tithe. But there's also a provision that God made that in the 6th year, you have such a crop that you wouldn't need anything for the 7th year. So that's a little bit more context that we'll need, but the important part of that is that the 7th year is where the land rests, and so you don't have a tithe that year. But we'll talk about that as we go through. So the first offering is not actually a tithe. But the first thing that you would do if you were a Jew, you would take all of the grain that you just harvested, and you would look at your flocks, if you had those, or your herds, meaning either your sheep and goats or your cattle, and you would say, okay, well, I've got so many new head of cattle, and I have so much grain, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2% or so of that initial harvest that I've made, and that is going to go to the Aaronic priesthood, which we just mentioned, those ones that specifically serve in the temple of God, or in the tabernacle before the temple was built. Okay? So right off the top, you're going to have 2% off of everything. So imagine that for your own income, and you can kind of apply it this way. You take 2% right off the top. That doesn't sound too bad. 2%'s not too much. But then that's just the first. So the second thing that you're going to do after you take that 2% off the top is that you're commanded to take a 10% tithe. And we understand tithe means 10%. So you take a straight 10% of the remaining 98%, I guess. So the math gets a little confusing with the percentages, but still, you're going to take another 10% of that. So essentially 12%, maybe a little less, as the first tithe. And it's called the Ma'aser Rishon, which means essentially first tithe. And this first tithe is this straight 10%. It is the tithe that would support the Levites specifically. And you find this in Numbers chapter 18, verses 20 and 21. That appears to be separate from the tithe that we talked about in Deuteronomy 14, verses 27 through 29. So already we have a couple of different things that have to take place. 2% plus now 10%. But that's not it. So in addition to that, we're not just giving 12%, but we're going to give another 10% of what's left. So now actually, I guess you're giving 10% of the 90% that you have left, or 88% that you have left. And this 10% is going to be, it's called the second tithe. It's also ma'aser sheni, which is taken from that remainder. It would be 9 or 8.5% of the gross. But you would store this up, and as you store it up, 3 times a year, you're going to have to go to Jerusalem. That's part of the whole Jewish system, is there are 3 feast days where you take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And with this 10%, you're going to take it to the temple eventually, but you're also allowed to use it as kind of a travel fund. So as you go to the temple, you can eat your supplies along the way. And you're not going to eat all of it, of course, but that was an allowance that was made. It would help you in that pilgrimage. So God's kind of saying, okay, set aside a little bit because you're going to have to make this journey every year anyway. And plus, when you get there, you're going to give the rest to me. So the second tithe is, again, going towards the tabernacle or the temple. It's going toward the offerings that are going to be made when you get there, the sin offerings for your own family, peace offerings, heave offerings, all the different offerings of the Old Testament. You're going to have stored up some of the food for that purpose. And whatever left appears to have gone into the treasury of the temple, or was converted into money and used for that purpose, or left for the priesthood. But then there is a third tithe. Now remember, tithe means 10%. So here's the question. If there's a third tithe, are you now saying that the Jews paid 32% of their money? Well, no, not quite. Because this tithe only happens every 3rd year of the 7-year cycle. So what does that mean? It means on year 1 and year 2, you pay the first and the second tithe, as well as the general offering that we talked about at the beginning, which means you're paying 22% every year. But then, on every 3rd year, so not the 1st year of the cycle, not the 2nd year, but the 3rd year, not the 4th year, not the 5th year, but the 6th year, you're going to pay this 3rd tithe. That's also called the poor tithe, and we'll say why that is in just a second. But you'll pay this extra tithe. And the question among scholars is it an additional tithe, or is it does it switch out with the second tithe? So is it that you're having to pay 22% all the time, and every 3rd year, instead of giving it to the Levites, you actually give it toward the poor? Is that what's happening? Or is instead it's actually 22% every year, but every 3rd year it's now 32%? And I don't know what the answer is for sure. People are pretty argumentative on that. So we won't come down firmly on that. We'll just give the results either way. But there's this third tithe that is given. Again, it's 10%, but now it's 10% of a lot less. But still, it is this 10% tithe. And it's called the poor tithe because it went primarily to the poor. The 3rd year, it seems that was just to give to the poor in general because they probably had need during that 5-year time span. But the 6th year, it makes a lot of sense. Most of you probably know anyway that there was a provision under the old law to take care of the poor by not gleaning all the way into the corners of your fields and leaving some of the harvest for the poor to collect themselves. Well, what happens in the 7th year of this cycle? In the 7th year, you don't plant anything, which means the poor can't harvest anything. And so on the 3rd year, you take care of them. But on the 6th year especially, you say, okay, the poor are going to need this next year when they don't have anything left to harvest. Again, we don't know for sure if that was in addition to the other 2 tithes or if it replaced the second tithe on those alternating years. I don't know which way it is. It could be either way. And people disagree with it quite a bit. But as we said back in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 20 and 22, again, Leviticus 25, that's where we see that provision that God would take care of them for this 6th year, so much so that they wouldn't need anything the 7th year. Now, in terms of the tithe itself, though, what that means is if you have double the crops that you were going to, you now pay double the tithe that you were going to. And so even though you don't technically pay anything on the 7th year, you make up for it in the 6th year. So if you average it out, it's all kind of going to be the same. So what do we learn from this? Well, first we need to ask the question, what does this add up to? Now that we've done all this work with different percentages, and it really, really depends on whether or not that one tithe is additional or not. And then, of course, you look at that 7th year and not tithing at all. And if you average it out, in theory, what most people come to is about 23 0.3%. Now, if you take out the other year, you're going to come to more like 21%, if you say those two are actually not overlapping or not stacking on top of each other, but instead are interchangeable. But either way, 21%, 23%, that's a lot more than 10%. And we look at the Old Testament Jews and we look at the system of tithing, we say, oh, they paid a tenth. Yes, they did. And another tenth, and another 2%, and another tenth some of the time. And that's a lot. And today when people advocate for tithing in the New Testament church, they probably should go back and calculate what the actual tithe was before they start suggesting it. Because if you say that 10% is the amount that Christians should give today, people will probably look at you a little angrily. But if you say that 23% is how much they're supposed to give the church, they're just going to leave. Because most people aren't doing that. Most people aren't even coming close to that. But of course, if you look at the national average, then people aren't even coming close to 10%. So what is the percentage that was paid on the Old Testament? It was about 21, 22, 23%, which is a lot of money. Are we commanded to do that today? No, we're not. There's a different system that we'll talk about in just a second. But all of this together, that 23.3%, that was not even including the command to be hospitable to those who came into your home. You don't get a tax deduction just because you were hospitable to somebody or generous in other ways. God commands generosity in the Old Testament just as much as he does in the New Testament. But it was expected, and any other charitable assistance that you gave, it was just expected. And it would be in addition to this amount. And you don't get to remove part of your tithe just because you did something nice for somebody. So it was a lot of money. And it would have been a whole lot for them. Now again, when we look at this, we recognize this is a tax in addition to giving. So if we look at our own situation, we say, well, how much do we give? Well, also, how much do we pay in taxes? Then you're probably going to come closer to this amount than if you remove the taxes entirely. And I realize that they're different, and it works differently today. We don't pay our taxes to God, but at the same time, that's kind of how this number exists. But today we do something different. So under the New Testament, it's a free will offering, meaning we give as we desire to give. And it's a better system, even if it doesn't always get you as much money. Why? Well, if this served as kind of a tax like it did on the Old Testament, then Brandon, as the treasurer, could audit you to see if you were paying the requisite 23.3% to the church each year. Does that sound good? Anybody want Brandon to come audit them and look at their finances? And no? Okay. Does that create a great feeling of generosity in you to have a certain amount demanded from you each year? Whenever you get, it's January right now. It's going to be April soon. So whenever that rolls around, are you going to look at the IRS and think, you know what? I think I'm going to give them a little extra this year. It won't happen. It can't happen that way. And under the Old Testament, it was required. Under the New Testament, it's not required. So how does it work? How do you know how much to give in the New Testament? Well, let's look at a passage that you've heard plenty before, but 2 Corinthians chapter 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And we'll just take a few principles from this passage. We're going to look down verse 6. That is once I get there. So how do we know how much to give? 2 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 6. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. And so let each one of us give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. So under the New Testament, with this passage and the passage Dan read for us from 1 Corinthians chapter 16, what do we know about giving in the New Testament system? How do we decide how much to give? Well, there's different things. There's a group of things that go together. Number one, we give as we've been prospered. As we've sowed and as we've reaped, that's how we give. Which means that if you have a really good year financially, there is an expectation that you'll give more financially. And when you have a really bad year financially, there's an expectation that you will give less financially. Because it, in that way, is kind of proportional in the same sense that the tithe was. So there's a similarity there, but the second thing is different. We give as we have purposed in our heart. Well, that's a lot different. It didn't matter what I'd purposed in my heart as a Jew. If I'd purposed to give 5%, that's not going to work. If I'd purposed to give even 10%, no, it's going to be 23%. Because it doesn't matter what I've purposed in my heart. Instead, it matters what the command is. A third thing is that we give happily. We give not reluctantly. So, under the Old Testament, yet again, you think there were ever people that gave reluctantly? I'm going to say it happened more often than not, because if you have to meet a certain dollar amount, there's always going to be a little bit of reluctance there. It's kind of like paying your taxes. You probably don't pay those quite as happily as you might give to the Lord. And the fourth thing is we give, verse 8 here, it says that God is able to make all grace abound toward us and give us all sufficiency to have abundance for every good work. We give as we trust God to give to us. So if I give and I say, well, money's a little tight and I don't know if I can give X amount this week. Well, how much do I trust God to say, well, he can make this happen? And there is a certain balance there. You also don't give to the point where you obviously can't make ends meet. But there is a requirement here for us to give in these ways, as God provides, as we have prospered happily. It sounds strange to be commanded to be happy when you do something, but that's partially our attitude and how we look at things. But with these things in mind, we say, okay, well, how much do we give? Now, again, I don't know what you give. I really don't know what you give. I make it a point, and I don't think that sounds boastful at all anyway, now that I'm about to say it, but I make it a point to not know what people give. I could easily look at the checkbook every week. I could easily go through the checks every week. I don't want to know, and I don't know, and I don't care what you give, except as much as it pertains to what we're talking about this morning. And if you're giving, but you're giving less than you've been prospered, that's an issue. If you're giving, but you're giving not as your heart directs you to, well, that's an issue too. And if you're giving, but you're not doing it happily, well, that's as much as an issue as any of these other things. And if you're giving, but you're not trusting God to provide for you, well, that's an issue. So I don't know what you give, but whatever percentage you give, or whatever amount you give each week, how does it compare? With a couple things. Number one, with a national average. Among those who call themselves Christians by any name, the national average is about 2% of their income goes toward giving. That's not a lot. It's less than 10%, and it's a lot less than 23.3%. But either way that you look at it, it's not a lot. Now, if that were as much as they've been prospered, that's fine. But that's usually not the case. So how does it match up with 2%? Could be worse, I guess. But you could also give that 2% as reluctantly as you could 50%. So there's always an issue with attitude there. But on the other hand, do you give 23.3%? I doubt it. I don't know. Some of you might, and that's pretty nice. But I doubt it. And I don't give 23.3%. And it sounds difficult to even do that. But at the same time, how much is our giving? And maybe that's not the best way to ask the question. In fact, I know it's not, because the better question is this: not how much do you give, not what percentage do you give, but how much can I give? And am I meeting that expectation of myself and from God? Again, not how much do I give, not what's the percentage, but how much can I do? What could I give? And of course, that's true for financial terms, but it's also true in non-financial terms. It's true of my time. It's true of the resources that I have aside from just money. What do I do with those? How do I help? So this morning, our question is not necessarily do you give 1%, 2%, 10%, 23%, but the question is what can you do? And what else can you do? What else can you give in means of time or in means of money? If we go away from the percentage idea, I brought this up before, but if there are, and this is kind of an estimate, if there are, let's say, just 25 households here that give anything, that's probably on the low end. But if there's 25 people here that decide that they're going to give $5 more per week, what does that do? Well, individually, that's kind of nothing. It's $250 a year, right? Does that sound like a lot over the course of a year? I hope not. Okay, well, what does that do if 25 different households decide to do that? $5 a week. Well, it's about $6,500 over the course of the next year. That's an increase of, I should have thought about this beforehand, but 5 or 6% of our entire budget for the year. Why? Because some people decided, yeah, I think I could put $5 more on that check. Or maybe I could put another 5 in the plate as it goes by. And I'm not trying to get into your pockets here, and I really don't care except as much as God cares about it. And God says we give as we prosper. God says we give as our hearts direct us to. We give happily, not reluctantly. And we give as we trust God to provide back to us. Now this morning, this is an opportunity, hopefully, for you to think. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, and it doesn't matter to me what you do, but it's an opportunity for you to say, okay, am I giving as much as I could? And what can I change this year about the giving that I do? So this morning, if that sparks a thought, obviously you can change that whenever you want to, and next week's a new opportunity, but think about it this year. Now this morning also, though, this has been a study of this one subject with some applications. But the bigger application in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 15 is that God has given us an indescribable gift. His indescribable gift is His Son, who is willing to die for our sins on the cross. Christ, fortunately, didn't give the national average of 2% to us. And He didn't give 23% to us, but Christ gave all. This morning, if you have a need that the church can help with, or this morning, if you need to respond to God's invitation, this is your opportunity as we stand and as we sing.
Give us the voice of Jesus, say.